Hello everyone. Welcome to the Poddercast.
You know, we asked you to share some books that you've been reading, and one that came up quite a bit was Adam Grant's Think Again.
Yeah, definitely a popular one.
So we thought we'd do a bit of a deeper dive into it with you. And what we're realizing more and more as we're sort of unpacking it is that in a world that just seems to be changing at a faster and faster pace, the ability to kind of rethink, re-examine our assumptions and really challenge our own thinking.
Yeah.
It's becoming more and more valuable. It's almost like a superpower.
It is like a superpower.
Yeah.
I think what Grant does so well in this book is he really makes the case that our initial thoughts or our initial strategies that we come up with,
Right.
that shouldn't be where the road ends. That ability to be flexible, to unlearn and to relearn is really crucial for navigating the kinds of complex problems that we face in the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with this deep dive, what we really wanted to do is extract from Think Again some of those really kind of key actionable insights that you can actually put to use in your own life. To help you kind of look at your own thinking in a new light, to question those assumptions that we all carry around with us, to adapt your perspective, and even to become more effective at how you communicate your ideas to other people.
Yeah.
So we're going to try and equip you with some really solid, Grant-inspired strategies. But I think before we jump into all of that, it's helpful to just really understand how easy it is to get stuck. How often do we see, really smart people or, successful companies fall into this trap of becoming too attached to their initial approach?
Oh, yeah.
They have all the talent, they have the resources, they have the right intentions, but they just can't seem to shift gears, even when it becomes so clear that the landscape around them has changed dramatically.
Absolutely. And one of the best examples, I think, to illustrate that is that of BlackBerry.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember them?
Oh, yeah. How could we forget?
I mean, they were the undisputed kings of the smartphone market.
Kings and queens.
Yeah. For a good period of time. I mean, if you went out, everybody had a BlackBerry.
I had one.
Business execs, celebrities, everybody, they really had this lock on how people connected with each other.
Yep.
And, back in 2009, I mean, they had over half the global market share for smartphones. They essentially defined what a smartphone was, right? With this emphasis on email and messaging and that early mobile web experience.
The little trackball.
Yeah, the trackball.
Typing with your thumbs.
So innovative at the time.
Huge, right.
So innovative, but then 2007 comes around.
Yep.
And, iPhone bursts onto the scene and, it brought with it this completely different paradigm, right?
Right.
Apps, music integration, video, that revolutionary touch screen. And what did Mike Lazaridis, the founder of BlackBerry, think about this? Well, he dismissed it as a passing fad.
A passing fad.
He just couldn't wrap his head around why people would need all that extra functionality, all that extra stuff beyond what a BlackBerry already offered.
Yeah. Right, because it already had everything, right? In his mind, it already had everything that anybody could ever possibly need.
Exactly. So this is such a perfect example of that unwillingness to reconsider something that has been successful.
Right.
That inability to look at their own winning formula and think, well, maybe this needs to change.
Yeah.
They were so convinced that they had the definitive answer to the question of what a smartphone should be that they didn't even think about the fact that that question itself was changing.
Right. That the whole game was shifting.
The game was shifting.
And what's interesting is, I think when we look back at that example, it seems so obvious, right? But the reality is that we all do this to some degree. And Adam Grant really suggests that taking a kind of scientific approach is a much more effective way of dealing with this kind of, rapidly changing reality that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, because the way scientists operate is they don't start with the answers, they start with the questions. They develop theories, but they don't treat those theories as like rigid doctrines.
Yeah.
They treat them as hypotheses to be tested and refined based on the data that they collect.
So applying that to, BlackBerry again, it would have meant sort of treating their market leadership not as some immutable truth,
Yeah.
but as this hypothesis that was constantly being challenged,
Yeah.
by new market entrants like the iPhone.
Exactly. They just have been asking themselves all the time, is our current strategy still the most effective way to meet the needs of our users in this evolving environment?
Right.
But instead, they just kind of doubled down
Again?
on their existing model, and maybe that was because they were blinded by that initial success. They had so much success early on, they thought, well, we must be doing everything right.
Right, exactly.
But, Grant actually shares a really interesting finding about this scientific mindset in the business world. He points to a study that was done on Italian startups, and they found that the startups that approached their strategies like scientists, so they were constantly experimenting, learning from the results, adapting when they hit roadblocks.
Yeah.
Those startups achieved significantly greater revenue growth. They were much better at acquiring new customers compared to the startups that stuck very rigidly to their initial plans.
Oh, wow.
So that kind of scientific mindset, that flexibility, that willingness to adapt really paid off.
That's a really powerful insight, right? Like, how often are we, whether in our careers or, in our creative pursuits and our relationships, how often are we approaching things with that same kind of, flexibility? Are we willing to say, hey, maybe this isn't the best way of doing this? Or are we treating our established methods as if they were these, unshakable truths?
It's a really good question to ask yourself, right? How open are we to adopting that kind of scientific humility and acknowledging that, maybe the way we've always done things isn't the best way moving forward? And I think this leads us to another really important idea in the book, which is the role of humility and the role of constructive criticism in actually helping us grow.
Yeah. He really emphasizes the idea that being able to admit that you might be wrong
Right.
is a fundamental step in being able to rethink anything. It sounds so simple,
It does.
and yet it's something that so many of us struggle with. Our egos get in the way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Our egos can be incredibly resistant to the idea that we might not have all the answers.
Right.
And, Grant actually highlights some research that really drives this point home. He discusses these studies where they looked at, people who performed the worst on assessments of emotional intelligence. And guess what? Those were the individuals who tended to overestimate their abilities the most.
Oh, wow.
They were also the least likely to be open to coaching or feedback.
Yeah.
Which is, the stuff that can actually help you improve, right? It's like they were too unaware
Yeah.
to even know what they didn't know.
It's almost as if the less competence we have, the more convinced we are of our brilliance.
Yeah.
And it's that overconfidence
Yeah.
that really then breeds that inflexibility in our thinking, right?
Absolutely. It puts up this mental barrier that prevents us from being open to new information or alternative perspectives. Humility, on the other hand, is that key that can unlock that barrier.
Yeah.
And it's not about lacking confidence in your abilities.
Right.
It's about having the self-awareness to recognize the limits of your current understanding
Right.
and to be open to learning from others and from new experiences.
Yeah, it's that balance, right?
Right.
Believing that you can do it,
Yeah.
that you have the ability to achieve your goals, but at the same time, also having that willingness to reevaluate your methods,
Yeah.
to challenge your underlying assumptions. That's a really important distinction, I think.
Absolutely. And Grant also explores how disagreement, productive disagreement, can actually play a role in challenging that overconfidence, especially within teams. And he introduces this really helpful distinction between task conflicts and relationship conflicts. conflicts.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What's the difference between those two?
Okay, so relationship conflicts, those are the ones that are, fueled by emotions and personal animosity.
Yeah.
They become about who's right on a personal level. And, they often just devolve into these unproductive and emotionally draining exchanges, right? Task conflicts, on the other hand, those are centered on the work itself, on the different strategies or methodologies, or the best way to achieve a common objective. So the debate is about how to win, not about who is right.
Right. And you can have a really robust disagreement about, the merits of one approach versus another without it feeling like a personal attack.
Exactly. And Grant, in his research on Silicon Valley tech teams, he found that the highest performing teams actually exhibited a greater degree of task conflict early on in their projects.
Interesting.
So they weren't afraid to challenge each other's ideas. They'd have these vigorous debates about what was the optimal path forward.
Yeah.
But the really important thing is they had very few relationship conflicts. So they could disagree very strongly on the merits of a particular idea without letting it damage their working relationships.
And so I guess the challenge then becomes, how do you cultivate more of that, task-oriented disagreement and minimize the unproductive stuff, the emotional stuff?
Exactly. And that leads us naturally to Grant's insights on the art of persuasion, because, you can change your own mind, but often we need to influence other people as well, right?
Right, exactly.
And what he points out is that simply overwhelming people with logic and facts isn't always the most effective strategy. People aren't purely rational creatures.
Nope.
And their beliefs are often really deeply intertwined with their identities and their emotions. So he outlines 3 key tactics that skilled persuaders tend to use.
Okay, let's hear them.
Okay, so the first one is they actively seek out common ground. He uses this really great analogy. He says, debates are like dances, not tug of wars.
Oh, I like that.
So instead of just trying to pull the other person to your side of the argument, with all your might, sometimes you need to take a step back to allow them to step forward. And it's about identifying those shared values, right?
Yeah.
And emphasizing those to make the other person more receptive to finding that kind of middle ground.
It's like if you're trying to figure out where to go to dinner with a group of friends.
Right.
Like, you don't necessarily start by saying, well, I want to go here.
Right.
It's like, okay, well, what kind of cuisine do we like?
Yeah.
All right, well, we all like Italian, so let's find an Italian restaurant.
Exactly.
And then narrow it down from there.
Yeah, that's a good example. The second tactic is to actually lead with fewer but stronger arguments.
Okay.
The natural inclination is to just kind of throw every piece of evidence that you have at somebody, hoping that sheer volume is going to persuade them.
Right.
But Grant talks about this really interesting study on donation requests. And they found that appeals that presented just one compelling reason for donating actually doubled the success rate.
Wow.
Compared to appeals that offered 2 reasons.
It's counterintuitive.
It is, but if you think about it, if you present this barrage of arguments, inevitably some of those are going to be weaker than others, right?
Yeah.
And so it gives the other person kind of more opportunities to pick it apart and find flaws.
Right, and maybe just dismiss your whole case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it really is about quality over quantity in your persuasive efforts. And then the third tactic is to, it comes back to that scientific mindset. Approach the conversation like a scientist, not a preacher.
Right.
So instead of simply proclaiming your viewpoint, as the absolute truth, ask questions.
Right.
Something as simple as, what aspects of my proposal don't quite sit right with you?
Right.
Can open up a much more productive dialogue.
It makes it less of a confrontation and more of a genuine conversation.
Yeah. And Grant actually shares this statistic. He says that top negotiators end about 20% of their arguments with a question,
Wow.
which is double the rate of average negotiators. So there's real power in inquiry in understanding where the other person is coming from and how they're thinking about it.
Yeah. And, we've talked about, how we can kind of change our own thinking and how we can approach conversations with other people in a more productive way. But what about when we come across really deeply ingrained beliefs, things that, have become part of somebody's identity?
Yeah.
How do you even begin to have a conversation about that? And Grant shares this really incredible story.
Yeah, he talks about Daryl Davis, who was an African-American R&B musician who back in the 80s started attending Ku Klux Klan rallies.
Oh, wow.
His goal was to try to understand their ideology and, believe it or not, to persuade some of the most committed racists in America
Wow.
to change their minds.
And he was successful.
He was successful.
He actually got people to leave the KKK.
Dozens of them. And, he even formed unlikely friendships with some of these people. He became the godfather to a former Klan member's child.
Oh.
It's an amazing example of the power of dialogue.
Yeah.
And what was so interesting about Davis's strategy was he didn't try to argue people out of their beliefs by, hitting them over the head with facts and figures.
Right.
Instead, he focused on gently highlighting the often very arbitrary nature of their beliefs.
And how did he approach that?
So he would ask these open-ended questions like, if you'd been raised in a family that didn't preach white supremacy, do you think you would still hold these same views today?
Right.
And it's such a simple question, but it's so profound.
Yeah.
Because it forces people to confront the origins of their beliefs.
Right.
And realize that, maybe these beliefs aren't based on some kind of inherent truth. Maybe they're based on the circumstances of my upbringing.
Yeah.
Or my social environment.
Right. So it's almost as if instead of directly attacking the belief itself, you're subtly kind of showing them that, hey, this belief that you hold so dear that feels so much like a part of you might actually just be a product of, your background or the people that you happen to have grown up around. That's really fascinating.
And, Grant actually shares this related thought experiment involving fans of, these rival sports teams.
Yeah.
Like the Yankees and the Red Sox, these groups that are notorious for their intense dislike of one another.
Right.
And he asked them to imagine that they'd been raised in a family that passionately supported the opposite team.
Oh, wow.
And what he found is that when they did that, when they really tried to imagine themselves in that situation, many of their deeply ingrained prejudices softened.
Wow.
It made them realize that so much of their animosity was based on this arbitrary group affiliation.
Right. Not on any actual difference between, what the teams represent or, the players. It's just, well, I was raised to hate this team.
It's just us versus them.
Yeah.
And again, it makes you think about your own life, right? How many of our own beliefs, the things that we hold to be absolutely true, are really just a product of our personal history or our environment?
And so, in a sense, I think what this highlights is that if you're trying to help somebody rethink something that they hold very deeply, the first thing is to not be condescending, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I think, that brings to mind the story of the vaccine skeptic mother and the doctor.
Marie-Helene and Dr. Arnaud Gagneur, he was called the vaccine whisperer.
Yeah.
And this is a great example of this principle in action, right? So you have this mother, Marie-Helene, who was, very understandably anxious about the potential risks of vaccination for her premature baby.
Right.
And Dr. Gagneur, instead of, launching into this very technical explanation of vaccine safety.
Right. Trying to prove you're wrong.
Yeah, or overwhelming her with statistics.
Yeah.
He used a technique called motivational interviewing. And this is essentially a communication style that's focused on asking open-ended questions. To really understand the other person's perspective and help them find their own reasons for change. So he asked her things like, what specifically worries you about vaccines? Or what are some of the risks that you're concerned about if Toby isn't immunized?
Right. Not let me tell you why you're wrong.
No.
But what are your fears?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, he really tried to get to the root of her anxiety.
So he was listening more than he was speaking.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key takeaway from that story, right?
Yeah.
Is that she ultimately chose to vaccinate her son.
Yes.
Not because she was bullied into it,
Yeah. Yeah.
not because she was lectured, but because she felt heard.
Heard and understood.
Yeah. And through that process, she was able to kind of come to her own realization.
Yeah, she found her own reasons to change her mind.
And I think it really underscores that human resistance that we have
Yeah.
to feeling like we're being controlled
Right.
or
Yeah.
dictated to.
Yeah. Yeah.
That, if you want to persuade somebody, it's not about imposing your views on them. It's about helping them explore their own thinking and maybe come to a different conclusion themselves.
Yeah, beautifully put. And that leads us to another really crucial aspect of fostering this ability to rethink. And that is moving beyond, this very simplistic black and white thinking and embracing complexity. A lot of issues in the world are complex.
Yes.
And I think, it brings to mind this whole conversation around Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. It was undeniably impactful in raising awareness about climate change.
Sure.
But, Grant suggests that the framing of it, which was often seen as truth versus denial, might have inadvertently contributed to polarizing the issue even further.
Yeah.
So yes, it galvanized a certain segment of the population, but
Yeah.
it also kind of solidified these opposing camps, right?
Right.
And the reality is, by 2018, there was still a very considerable percentage of Americans who just didn't view climate change as a priority. And he talks about this concept of binary bias, which is this tendency that we all have as humans to simplify complex issues into these very neat categories.
Right versus wrong.
Right versus wrong, good versus bad. And that really hinders our ability to rethink things.
Yeah.
Because the reality is that most people actually hold more nuanced views than that.
Right.
They might, for instance, acknowledge the reality of climate change, but they may also have legitimate questions or concerns about the economic implications of, certain solutions.
Right.
And so when you present the issue as this stark binary, you're almost forcing people to choose a side
Yeah.
based on their identity or their pre-existing beliefs, rather than really engaging thoughtfully with the nuances of the issue.
And so, presenting an issue like climate change, for example, by really saying, look, there's the science, there's the economics, there's the ethics.
Yeah.
Right. That's actually going to foster more openness to rethinking.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting that there's actually research that shows that experts who openly acknowledge the uncertainties within their own fields are often perceived as more credible, not less,
Right.
because it shows a deeper understanding of the complexity of the issue.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's important to embrace the shades of gray and avoid presenting things in these overly simplistic terms,
Right.
especially if our goal is to encourage people to think more deeply and to consider changing their minds.
And finally, one of the last big ideas that we wanted to touch on from Think Again is Grant's emphasis on cultivating what he calls learning cultures, whether that's within organizations or even our personal lives.
Yeah.
This idea that we should view mistakes not as failures, but as opportunities for growth and learning.
Yeah, and he uses the tragic story of the 2003 Columbia Space Shuttle disaster to illustrate the dangers of a culture that prioritizes, flawless performance above all else.
Right. So talk about that a little bit. How did that play into, the events that unfolded there?
So, NASA at the time, they had what was called this this performance culture, right? And this inadvertently created this environment where admitting errors or raising concerns was actively discouraged. So the engineers, they became hesitant to escalate this issue of foam damage during the launch.
Right.
Even though it posed a significant risk, because the culture was so focused on flawless execution.
Right. We don't make mistakes.
Exactly. And so they didn't.
And of course, the consequences of that were devastating.
Right.
And Grant contrasts that with what he calls learning cultures, where the primary focus is on growth and development. So in these cultures, individuals, they feel safe to admit mistakes. They feel encouraged to experiment, to try new things, and importantly, to adapt their approaches based on what they learn from those experiences.
Yeah.
So in these environments, rethinking becomes the norm.
Yeah.
An ongoing process.
An ongoing process. And organizations with these kinds of cultures tend to be more innovative, more resilient, and ultimately less susceptible to those kinds of catastrophic failures. And the idea of psychological safety is really critical here. Creating an environment where teams can take risks, voice dissenting opinions,
Yeah.
without fear of punishment or ridicule.
Right. So it's okay to be wrong
It's okay to be wrong.
and to experiment and to learn.
Exactly.
And so as we kind of bring this deep dive into Think Again to a close, the thing that really keeps coming back to me is this idea that rethinking is so powerful.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about individuals
Yeah.
or teams or even society as a whole.
Absolutely.
Imagine a world where we approached all of our beliefs and opinions as provisional hypotheses.
Yeah.
Things that are always open to revision in light of new information.
Yeah.
Imagine a world where intellectual humility was more valued than unwavering certainty,
Yeah.
and where curiosity served as the primary bridge for overcoming disagreements.
I love that.
It's such a compelling vision to strive for.
It really is.
And for me, one of the key takeaways is that by cultivating our own willingness to step back and reconsider our perspectives, we actually create more space for other people to come forward with their own valuable insights and ideas.
That's right.
So for you, listener, here's a final thought to kind of carry with you. Think about one belief that you currently hold really strongly.
Yeah.
What would it look like to approach that belief as if it were a hypothesis? What kind of information could you actively seek out that might challenge it?
Yeah.
And what could you potentially learn from that process?
Yeah. What could you learn?
Regardless of whether or not your original belief actually changes,
Exactly.
it's in that ongoing willingness to question and to rethink
Yeah.
that true learning and meaningful growth really reside.
I completely agree.
So there you have it. That is our deep dive into Think Again.
Yeah. Fantastic book.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. We hope it gave you some food for thought and some practical strategies to apply in your own life. And we look forward to diving into another book with you soon.